Hi everyone, welcome to the Origins of the Cold War Part 3. I want to go through this particular segment fairly quickly because with each of these topics, it's really easy to get bogged down. So I want to rely a little more heavily on the textbook for these particular topics. So the questions to think about: which incidences during the Cold War did the Truman administration have to deal with? And how did the Truman administration's responses to these incidences represent examples of containment in action? When we take a look at when does the Cold War start, this is actually a debate for historians of the 20th century, because most historians will argue that the Cold War begins as soon as World War II is over in 1945. But there are some historians who argue that the Cold War actually started before World War II was over in 1943, when Joseph Stalin starts to become frustrated that the Allies haven't opened up the second front yet. Other historians argue that the Cold War doesn't actually begin until 1947, and this is why. They're pointing to the Truman Doctrine. So the backstory of this situation is that we have two incidences going on. The first is a civil war in Greece, where communist rebels are trying to overthrow the democratically elected government. And Britain had been supporting that government. But in 1947, President Truman gets a message from the British government saying, we can no longer afford to assist the Greek government. And so we're going to have to remove our troops from this scenario. And it's implying, of course, that if you, the United States, don't do something, then Greece will probably end up being a communist nation. On the flip side, we have a situation that's happening in Turkey. And take a close look at the map on the screen and find Turkey. Turkey is in a strategic point. The Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea are connected through two waterways that Turkey controls. They have been receiving pressure from the Soviet Union to turn over control of those waterways to the Soviet Union. But Turkey doesn't want to do that. But the problem is they don't really have the military might to say no and defend that position. So in March of 1947, President Truman is going to ask Congress for $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey. And the idea here is that this is containment in action, because if we don't help the democratically elected Greek government, they will fall to communism. And that's exactly the kind of opportunity that Kennan had warned and why containment was necessary. And then the same thing with Turkey. If we don't support their efforts to resist Soviet bullying, then they will fall and Soviet influence will spread. And so 1947, Congress passes the so-called Truman Doctrine that provides this money and this aid. But it's also a great example of containment in action. 1948, another example of containment in action. One of the things that we've noticed is that economic hard times can lead people to do drastic things. If we look back at Germany in the 1920s, how does someone like Adolf Hitler come to power? And it has to do with the desperation of the German people during these hard economic times. And so the man pictured here was Truman's Secretary of State, George C. Marshall. And he had produced this plan to provide economic aid, basically an economic stimulus to European nations to build up their economies, to get them back on their feet, and to make communism less attractive. This is already a concerning situation because by the time we get into 1948, the Communist Party in France is actually pretty strong. And so Marshall is going to use that as evidence for providing this economic stimulus. Congress, however, is concerned about the price tag. Now, the funny thing is, depending on which textbook you consult, the dollar amount for the Marshall Plan varies between $13 billion and $22 billion. So what I did here is just pick $17 billion because it was kind of in the middle. Congress doesn't like that price tag. They think this is way too much money to be spending on rebuilding other nations. But in March of 1948, there is a coup d'etat, a revolution in Czechoslovakia that is backed by the Soviet Union. And it creates a communist government in Czechoslovakia. Once that happens, Congress agrees that spending this money is necessary to preventing the spread of communism throughout Western Europe. So that's how this is a great example of containment in action. And it's a great example of Keynesian economics. Once again, the US is pumping money into these countries to help rebuild themselves, and it works. By the early 1950s, we see this broad industrial revival taking place in Europe. People are back to work, they're making money, and the best part of it is that American businesses are going to benefit from this. I mean, if we think back to one of the causes of the Great Depression, it was overproduction and the fact that Europeans couldn't afford to buy our stuff. So this is not only rebuilding the European economies for their own sake, but rebuilding European economies so that they can buy American-made products. A third incident during the Truman administration, and this is where I kind of don't want to get bogged down. I'm just going to give you a really basic overview of what happened here in the Korean War. At the end of World War II, the United States had accepted the Japanese surrender in the southern part of the Korean Peninsula. And the Soviet Union had accepted the Japanese surrender in the northern part of the Korean Peninsula. So there's sort of this de facto separation of Korea in the immediate post-World War II period. But during this period of separation, the Soviet Union is going to encourage the development of a communist faction within the northern part of the Korean Peninsula. And on June 25th, 1950, North Korean forces are going to invade South Korea. President Truman argues that this is essentially Northern Korea acting as a puppet or an extension of the Soviet government. He believes that the Soviet Union is behind this attack, and he's not necessarily wrong. But the reason this is important is it expands the idea of containment beyond Europe. When George Kennan created the idea of containment, he was speaking very specifically about Europe. And now President Truman is taking this idea and expanding it all over the planet. But here's where it gets interesting, is that President Truman does not go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war. Instead, he has the U.S. ambassador to the UN create a resolution declaring Northern Korea to be an aggressor, and that a UN peacekeeping force would be sent to remove that army from the southern part of Korea. Now, what should have happened is that the Soviet delegate should have voted no and killed the whole resolution. But if we remember back to the story of the UN, the Soviet delegate had stormed out in protest over the China issue. And so when the vote was held in the Security Council, the Soviet delegate wasn't there to vote no. By the way, this would be the last time the Soviet delegate would try to boycott the UN meetings. So North Korea would be called the aggressor. 15 countries would join the peacekeeping effort, although most of the troops that fought in the Korean War were American. Here's the other important part about the Korean War, and that is Truman has set a precedent for American action. We did not declare war. Congress did not vote to declare war. What happened was American troops went to war by order of the president through the United Nations. So this is going to be the very first time that we're going to see this course of action. And the sad thing is that since then, this is how we have sent our troops into battle. I mean, if we think to the last time, and today is, March of 2020, when was the last time the United States declared war on another nation? It was December of 1941. That was the last time Congress declared war on anybody. Since then, whether it's the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, or the post 9/11 conflicts, all of those have taken a different route. And Truman had paved this way with the Korean conflict. The war is really slow, it's really bloody, and it's not until July of 1953 that we see a ceasefire in this conflict. But what it does is it's going to permanently divide Korea, roughly at about where it had been divided after World War II. So coming back to our questions to think about, I want to recap both questions essentially at the same time. So which incidences did the Truman administration have to deal with, and how do they represent examples of containment in action? When the US got involved in Greece and Turkey with the Truman Doctrine, we wanted to prevent the expansion of communism into Greece and Turkey. So the Truman Doctrine is containment in action. When it comes to the Marshall Plan, same story. We had watched Czechoslovakia become a communist nation, and that convinces Congress that the Marshall Plan stimulus is necessary to prevent the rest of Western Europe from becoming communist. So again, containment in action. And then finally, with the Korean War, it was a situation where communism had moved into the northern part of the peninsula, and the UN was trying to prevent the expansion of communism into the southern part of the Korean peninsula. So stay tuned for part 4 of the origins of the Cold War.